You are watching In Conversation This Week with Miceal O'Hurley.
Hi, I'm Declan Power, and I will be the moderator for today's panel, National Readiness in Confronting Emerging Threats and Continuing Cyber Warfare. On behalf of Diplomacy in Ireland, European Diplomat, let me thank our sponsor, Palo Alto Networks, a global leader in cybersecurity. And now, our first guest is Chuck Brooks, a 2 times US presidential appointee, CEO of Brooks Consulting International, and adjunct faculty at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Over to you, Chuck.
Hi, thank you everyone, and for inviting me to be part of this webinar with a great group of international experts on cybersecurity. I'm here to present really the transatlantic perspective on what's happening with emerging threats in cyber warfare, and I'm focusing more on the big players and the state actors that I think are impacting a lot, particularly when it comes to trying to breach critical infrastructure. So I prepared a short little slide deck and to go over the issues. So obviously there's trends that are impacting this in a big way, and the most significant trend I think is the attack surface has gotten so great because of the COVID-19 and remote work, and a lot of companies moving to remote offices. Just made it a field day for hackers, for organized criminal hackers, but also for state actors. And also the expansion of the Internet of Things, which added another whole bunch of vectors and entry points for hacking. And then, security investments, they're continue to be driven by these persistent threats and policies and new technologies. And what we also see in the big trends now is that there's new emerging technologies that are coming online that are being used both by the good guys defending themselves and by the hackers. And this includes artificial intelligence, machine learning, soon to be more 5G platforms, and of course, as I mentioned, IoT. So there's operational shifts going on. And so we see a new paradigm in the attack surface. The nation state actors, as I mentioned, have really begun to focus a big time, and we saw this with SolarWinds, on showing their capabilities in being able to damage or destroy infrastructure, particularly critical infrastructure. And you see this as now not just a kinetic scenario of warfare, but a digital scenario of warfare. And the reason this is because it's cheap, it's low risk, effective, plausible deniability. And a lot of these state-based cyber attacks are easy to do. So Russia, China, Iran, North Korea have been the primary targeted of opportunity against the United States and other countries, and particularly in Europe too, and with North Korea also a lot with Asia. But they've done this with relative impunity, and the game is changing a little bit. The FBI now, after Colonial Pipeline, actually went after some of the ransomware hackers. So there's a different, as I mentioned earlier, different paradigm going on. And the reason they do this is for several reasons. Why they have cyber attacks, these state-sponsored actors, is because they probe and exploit national infrastructure vulnerabilities. They gather intelligence, and they exploit money from systems and people. And the last one sort of goes, it's a confluence, because a lot of these criminal gangs work loosely with state sponsors and collectively with each other. And obviously financial remuneration, particularly in the era of cryptocurrency and ransomware, which is booming right now, even though it's been around for decades, is really one of the motivating factors for some of these organizations. So the security threats significantly rising. This was from a lecture by Mike McGuire, a senior lecturer at the University of Surrey, found 100% rise in significant nation-state incidents between 2017 and 2020. That's a huge amount of growth in state-sponsored attacks. And if you think that the most common targets are enterprise-class organizations, they're hitting media, financial, government, regulators, and of course, critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure is probably underrepresented there because it really covers, finance, health, energy, communications anyway. So a lot of these vectors are not really reflected well in this data here. So the top threat actors I mentioned, Russia accounted for the majority of the state-sponsored attacks. You saw it again with SolarWinds. You saw a lot with the ransomware attacks. 58% of all nation state attacks during 2021, according to the Digital Defense Report by Microsoft. Second state responsible for most cyber attacks was actually North Korea, and then Iran, and then China. But this is not necessarily, again, reflective of the reality of the threats from cybersecurity, because they're doing these for different purposes. Iran and is to cause a lot of destruction against their neighbors, particularly in the Gulf, and aimed against Israel. North Korea is because that's basically their whole lifeline of their economy is cybersecurity corruption, and then China, which has other purposes. And let me go to that. The Chinese are really focused more on espionage, and they've been doing this for decades. Particularly the United States, they've been very successful. They've taken a lot of our hypersonic technology. They've really targeted life sciences. Cyber espionage has been really a main focus. They've actually, if you go back a few years, they stole all the OPM personnel files and security clearances. So they have a huge network of digital spies. They work for the government. It's very consolidated. They have a lot of the army working too. So that to say that just Russia is the main threat is sort of misleading, because Chinese are very persistent and more patient and less focused on monetary issues, but more on state issues, interests of basically where their geopolitics are going. So how do we defeat a lot of this? This has been the problem for a long time, is that we're used to initially dealing with script kiddies and small hackers, and you had a whole lot of problems with that, insider threats, etc. But now we see a world where there's a lot more state-sponsored activity, a lot more capabilities, more sophisticated equipment and tools they're using, and a lot more efforts being focused globally on companies too that are basically operating as multinational groups. So the traditional three elements, the pillars for security strategy, have been security by design. Of course, that's really important. The problem is that most of the world is running on legacy systems, as we found out a long time ago with WannaCry. But most countries just do not have the ability to build from scratch and do things. So they basically patch on or bolt on a lot of the systems. Defense in depth has been traditionally what the United States has been using with the technologies of air gapping, hardening, encryption, etc., using all the different levels, and then segmenting OT and IT, which has not really been successful so much. And so that's why we've gone to, in the United States recently, at what is called a zero trust model. Basically, you just don't trust anything you're connected to, whether it be a device or person, before you check it out and verify it. And that's been implemented now. There's a Pentagon office opening up next month. There's a DHS has pushed it, and the presidential dictum has said that zero trust must be enforced in all agencies. So the United States has realized, since the internet was built, not for security, but for communications, that there's just too many vulnerabilities to pursue any kind of cybersecurity strategy without looking at everything as being a threat. And so that's really what the government is doing. And they're trying to push it with the private sector. And that's the other element of this, is that there needs to be more cooperation with the private sector. There's a lot of new programs being pushed by the Department of Homeland Security, a lot of new funding and legislation in the United States aimed at that effort, because when you're talking about critical infrastructure, the private sector operates or owns most of that private infrastructure. The government regulates it. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities there, and they realize they cannot do it alone. And we're seeing also now trends, and this is evident also in the Colonial Pipeline, is that some of these state actors are really targeting OT and IT vulnerabilities. A lot of these systems were meshed, and so with the Colonial Pipeline example, they got into the IT system, but the OT system was not able to determine whether it had been corrupted too. So you have a lot of vulnerabilities. You have to redo policies. Goes back to the strategies of risk management. But there's a real, I'd say, alarming threat now going on with critical infrastructure, particularly where all these mix and mesh of OT and IT systems are operating. And so, as I mentioned, zero trust. This is really a good quick overview of where the U.S. government's going. This came just recently from a OMB memo, I think 2 days ago, and it's organized around 5 pillars which the U.S. is pursuing, which is identify the enterprise-wide identity, access to applications, where they work, etc. Know the devices that you have, complete inventory. Another big issue is that most companies, and of course governments too, just don't know what devices are connected to their networks, and that's a real problem. So this is really an interesting perspective to go back and look at everything and start from scratch, have an inventory, domain system names, etc., application workloads, and data. So I just wanted to make this a short presentation. I just want to say this is where the United States and transatlantic perspective, I think, is going, and we're sharing it a lot with Europe because we realize that the cat's already out of the bag, and you really can't patch everything and be reactive. You have to be proactive, and zero trust is really a proactive strategy, really just cleaning the slate, starting from scratch, and then developing strategies around that. I, for one, think it's a good strategy. I think you still need to incorporate design from the start too. There is a lot of new kind of developments coming in that could help that, particularly with space and satellites. And I also think you keep some of the defense in depth. There's a lot of redundancy, but a lot of that's already in there too. So I think we're going to see a sea change of different policies and investments, which we're seeing now in the United States, particularly with billions now being invested in cybersecurity. And the paradigm shift is obviously it's not just kinetic geopolitical threats, now it's digital threats. And that is a global issue, not just from the United States. So that's it for now. And thank you for the quick presentation. I'll answer questions later and let everyone else present.
Chuck, you spoke about zero trust. When I think about the SolarWinds infiltration, it was sleeping in the background, stealing data and compromising systems for almost a year before it was detected. Even if we start with zero trust today, how likely is it that there is another SolarWinds lurking on devices, networks, and even trusted software that hasn't yet been detected?
Oh, I mean, there's no doubt that there's already many corrupted devices and hidden software in a lot of enterprises. Again, there's not enough penetration testing. Again, people don't have inventory of their devices. They don't know what's attached. It doesn't necessarily have to be digital. It could be a physical device attached to it, and they don't know that either. So, it is problematic, with some of these larger enterprises to go and really try and start over. But, discovery is half of it, to identify what's in your network. And then I think really the real other part of this element is, with zero trust is you got to really determine what data you want to protect and segment that data and keep it, backed up. You can't do everything. But if you just do that alone and encrypt it, you're doing some of the right things. But again, I think the SolarWinds thing was a wake up call, but I don't doubt that there's other hidden elements. And I think there's it's been a few years ago, IBM tested the ability to use biometrics and machine learning and artificial intelligence to basically trigger stuff. So we're going to see with these new technologies coming on board that it's going to be easier to mask things. You have deep fakes. You have a whole lot of different threats now that are going to make it much more difficult. And that's why I think, again, zero trust is a policy that needs to be looked at. If for nothing else, it's just to be able to review everything you have in your network.
Given how complex America is, with 50 different states, each with dozens, if not hundreds of counties and thousands of municipalities, and we have a reflection of that diversity in the European Union, and given the multitudes of agencies governments have at every level, then add in private sector, non-profits, and educational institutions. How realistic is it that we can realize cooperation in implementing a strategic or technical effort to enhance our security environment, given the interconnectivity of all that I just mentioned?
Well, I think there's a lot of probably solutions to that problem, but none of them are easy. One is obviously you need to have more incentives for the private sector. you need to get them up front in a lot of this activity. Government really, like I said, could only control a lot of the regulatory issues. They're moving to do more than that. And as you mentioned earlier, the state and local have their own issues. Some of that's been rectified because they're getting funding for the first time ever to deal with these cyber issues. But as you said, it's a huge problem because it's like having 50 countries. Then we have all these different elements of jurisdiction between the private sector, governments, quasi-government organizations. So I think what we really need, if you're big, is a cyber moonshot. And I don't think it should be just the United States. I think it should be the allied world to look at all the new technologies we have in our as tools to help protect ourselves, work together like a NATO organization to really prioritize cybersecurity to threats to protect small and medium businesses as well as critical assets, because it's just going to get more and more dangerous every year. And there's a lot of expertise out there, involve a lot of the big companies, small companies, but I think it really needs to be, a global moonshot on this because there's too much at stake. I mean, if something does happen, if the system, just even with the Colonial Pipeline, that taken down for a week caused, all kinds of unrest and price issues and gouging and transportation issues. So think about what happened if energy or grid was taken down in a country, the damage it could do. So I think this is something we have to look at in the world of the digital fusion with physical. And so I think, it's maybe an aspiration rather than reality, but I think we need to do that.
Given how politicians control budgets and civil servants have a tendency to protect their turf, it will be interesting to see if people are willing to cede power and cooperate, even if it is critical to fundamental security and in our collective best interest. So Chuck, fascinating insights. I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Let's go now to our next panelist, Nika Aleksejeva. Nika brings a unique perspective, having studied matters from a media and social media perspective in the hotspot of the Baltics, as the lead researcher for the Baltics at the Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Lab. Nika, we're looking forward to your perspectives.
Sure. Let me do that by sharing a couple of slides that I prepared to illustrate a few case studies that I think are quite telling. Just briefly, I don't come from cybersecurity perspective. Nevertheless, I'm embedded in a NATO Stratcom COE Center of Excellence Center in Riga. And therefore, I come from more media, strategic communication, and political science perspective. I've been monitoring the information environment of the Baltic states for the last 5 years, seeing shifts. And as we are talking more about emerging challenges and future threats, let me just go on. And before I jump into case studies, just to make clear, in our research, we use open source materials that anyone can access online. And we try to connect the dots to tell more about processes that concern democracy, security, and technology. So as for the case studies, of course, coming from the Baltic states, Russia is the main threat actor over here. And just to illustrate one mean of influence, which is very influential, is actually through humor. People in the Russian internet believe that this person is the former president of Estonia, Toomas Hendrik Ilves, that they characterize as being of alternative sexual orientation. And so they use this image in context as well with the Swedish king, who indeed loves to wear weird hats, and also Russian political leaders as the leader of Chechnya Republic, Ramzan Kadyrov, and Vladimir Putin. And you can see from the framing that the main message is that the West has rotten values, while Russia preserves more conservative values, the strength, the stability. And of course, it's partially projected or mostly projected to their internal audience, but of course it catches eye and spins out of internal Russian information space into spaces where Russian language is also a thing. I will also present a few cases how also English language space is penetrated. But as about this man, of course, you probably, if you have seen Toomas Hendrik Ilves, Now from other shots, you can tell that this is not really him. And this image comes from Pride Parade in Argentina in 2015. Nevertheless, gradually, it turned into this meme of Thomas Hendrik Ilves. And if you see side-by-side comparison, of course, there are some visual resemblances, and you can start an argument about it. But if you compare their ear limbs, you see that these are two completely different people. So it also illustrates part of the methods that we use in visual analysis to basically look into details and see story beyond what's obvious. Another telling case study is about recent case when Latvian parliament, but not only, was pranked by Russian pranksters Lexus and Vovan. But at that time, it was unknown. And in April, a member of Latvian parliament, Rihards Kols, went public on Facebook telling that, in fact, he was talking with a fake imposter of Leonid Volkov. And Leonid Volkov is close ally of Alexei Navalny, who is now in jail for actually being poisoned, which is, of course, very bizarre situation overall. But the timing overlapped with quite a broad scale protests in Russia against Navalny's incarceration. So this case then spinned into public domain because Latvian state broadcast television picked up the story and interviewed the imposter, who suggested that the successor of Alexei Navalny will be Yuri Duch, which is another blogger, but he never showed political ambitions. And for those more aware of Russian internet sphere, that sounded as nonsense at that point. Nevertheless, it was presented as truth. Later, journalist apologized, interviewed real Volkov. But at the time when this case appeared, everyone thought that, hey, it was so convincing, probably deepfake technology was used and then broadcasted live during these live calls that journalists and members of Latvian parliament experienced. We didn't have any recordings of these meetings. They appeared later. And later, it turned out that Latvian parliament did not ask to use a camera for that person that later turned out to be imposter. And with other European parliaments and institutions that these pranksters played, you see that they used image, or they used basically a man that shares against some visual similarities with Leonid Volkov, but basically it's hairstyle, beard, image is backlit, so it's hard to see facial features. Also, the quality of camera is not the best. And here you can clearly see that this is basically a makeup and this weird position in front of a camera that was used. So at that point, it felt that, well, it must be like very advanced technology that was used and really worked to trick Latvian parliament, but it appeared to be basic social engineering and the lack of basically procedures that would prevent such cases was missing. And that was, we can interpret it as basically testing the boundaries and vulnerabilities, also the processes as they go in more kind of informal sphere. And that could be a clear vulnerability, not only for reputational risks, but of course also cyber infrastructure risks. And finally, of course, Russia's influence in the region is ongoing. And to illustrate that, there is English language media outlet, The Baltic Word, which writes in English, both news, but also feature stories about the Baltic states. And these stories oftentimes portray NATO in negative light. These stories, featured columns, are written or attributed to, and we call them user personas, because we can't identify their physical kind of appearance in the real world. There are no video recordings where they participate as experts or any images from conferences to basically tell that these are people that we can physically meet on the street. But they had many social media accounts and accounts on self-publishing platforms where actually the Baltic word was quite amplified in 2019. But this year, we noticed that Balt News, which is a media outlet which operates in all 3 Baltic states, mostly in Lithuania, it translated few of these columns, all sharing negative sentiment towards NATO, that was later actually amplified on Russian internal media outlets. And many of these outlets are actually connected with St. Petersburg troll farm. So though it's, again, kind of whitewashing content for internal audience, we can see that this media outlet, the Baltic Word, is really there to create an image that the West or Western outlet, what it thinks about the Baltic states, what it thinks about the NATO presence in the Baltic states. Therefore, it's basically long time kind of played operation, if you may tell, because we expect that we will see this outlet in other contexts used as well. So to sum it up, what characterizes information operation, or rather approaches to them, is adapting to users' interests and internet trends, blending into what's popular, what's trending, also testing vulnerabilities, and mimicking conventional media behavior, which makes it harder for regular user to understand which media outlet to trust or not. And that actually leads us to emerging threats, which first is exploiting existing societal divisions. In all 3 Baltic states, there is very clear resistance to a mandatory COVID-19 vaccination that was introduced starting from summer in some countries, and in Latvia it was introduced in autumn. So though we have a good vaccination rates overall, it was we see that public resistance for that part of society who resist vaccines is then exploited for political motives used by populist politicians. But this issue will not disappear. Public disobedience will remain, and that could be exploited for other reasons, especially because conspiracy theories, international conspiracy theories about starting from QAnon, going to the Great Reset idea, are embedded into narratives that make question not only, say, elected power elite and corrupt mass media or mainstream media, but also democracy overall and all the processes that are kind of mainstream. You can argue that they are all conspiration by lizard people eventually, but nevertheless, the boundaries are very thin if people are lured into conspirational thinking. And finally, climate change, which actually requires change of our behavior. Think of energy saving, think of green transportation and other things, will face natural, very organic resistance, because everyone is resistant to changes. And it could grow into another societal division that could be exploited for various purposes, especially if blended with conspiracy theories. So this is what I can share from my domain, which is, again, less cyber, more public media. And yeah, look forward for your questions. Thank you.
Nika, that's been a very interesting insight, but can you tell me more about the exploitation of information to sow social dissent in Europe and destabilize governments by undermining confidence in democracies? And I'm wondering, have you been following this trend in your work? And if so, what do you make of it?
Yes, I've been monitoring, and I think that's exactly the strategy. I think this is more of a kind of the short-term opportunistic use of what has been done for a long time. This is just another opportunity. And well, this is basically exploiting European values. One of values, or rather value-based decisions, was to cope with migration crisis in the Middle East when it emerges. And therefore, there's an argument that Merkel herself called migrants to come to Germany. But now we see that this is actually manufactured migration crisis for very different purpose. Basically, it's Lukashenko's power play with first Poland and Lithuania, who started hosting many opposition leaders who are still very active and probably not making life very easy for Alexander Lukashenko. And well, Latvia, because it's also a bordering country and also was aligned with Poland and Lithuania. But then in general, also, yeah, clashing Poland, Lithuania, and kind of the core of EU, which we consider being Germany, France, Italy could be used more if they wanted to deepen the division internally within the EU. Nevertheless, we saw that it was very transparent attempt. Therefore, there was also very clear political signals from the EU to show the overall solidarity. Therefore, indeed, yeah, it was again, probably also testing some boundaries. Is EU community really kind of consistent with values as such? And well, now it appears that basically it's not about, well, it's also about the context, and we will not also let be manipulated through our values. That's very clear signal that has been sent.
So history has shown that prior to Russia's occupation of Moldova's Transnistria region, and before their invasion and occupation of Georgia, they increased their exploitation of media to sow dissension in their target areas. Now that we see Russia once again amassing troops in a posture to invade Ukraine, is the Atlantic Council tracking any trends that might give us an insight into what Russia may or may not do in the short term?
Yeah, well, Ukraine is probably the next hotspot that everyone's eyeballs is on. And here I will refer to work of my colleagues who are more focused, because we are many researchers at the DFR lab. I'm focused on the Baltic states. I have also 2 colleagues focused on Ukraine specifically. Therefore, what they see is indeed there is social evidence on social media that corroborates military buildup, especially not only on Russian territory, but also Belarusian territory, which is quite worrying. And therefore, migration crisis caused by Belarus should be seen in the context with the military buildup next to Ukraine's border, especially because Europe has showed very strong position into not making it easy for Belarus. Therefore, Ukraine could be also the next target where migrants could be directed. We haven't seen that in large scale now. Of course, we've seen that numbers of migrants going also to Ukraine to later enter EU has increased, but not to an extent that it would be super, super worrying. Nevertheless, these 2 issues are connected. And yeah, overall, it's very worrying that, well, for instance, in Russia, NATO and Ukraine are blamed for this military escalation that's taking place. And also we see that these ideas are also amplified in, say, the Baltic information spaces. We are in a process of evaluating what's the extent and should we worry, because we see that there are narratives telling that actually NATO and Ukraine provoked Russia for this military buildup. And as we are still in the process, I can't share any estimates of like how worrisome it is that maybe EU, or at least eastern part of the European Union, will side with Russia in some regards, or at least part or significant part of their society will side with Russia on that. Hopefully not, but we are still in progress to assess that.
Now, our next guest is a recognized expert in cyber warfare. Coming to us from Trend Micro is Joel Aliburu. Joel, fill us in if you can.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. Thanks very much for inviting me here. I think over the next couple of minutes, I'll just be sharing a couple of thoughts around cybersecurity, around cyber warfare, a bit academic, and also in terms of how it can be seen to feed into contemporary conflict and keyed into what we see in the professional setting of observing things as security analysts. I do always like to talk about the world war historian Hughes Strachan whenever I talk about warfare, because his definition of what of space itself actually defining its own self one of the key complexities we have, which is how do we define the cyberspace, and Strachan once argued that one of the central challenges confronting international relations in its own self today is that we do not really know what war is and what war is not, and that can definitely be said about the cyberspace, because it has proven so difficult to define what constitutes the cyberspace, primarily because of its lack of dimensionality. And when you think about land and sea and air, we definitely know what's there, and they are measured in terms of dimensions, and that really cannot be said when you talk about cyberspace in its own self. I like Amy Zagat. Amy Zagat, she's really huge in cybersecurity, very, very intelligent woman. I like how she actually puts it perfectly, when describing it, where she talks about it being like this very huge marketplace where everyone actually just comes in there and right there, interconnected, speaking to each other or seeing each other or having the capacity to see each other if you look in the right places. But then right there, you still have, criminals and full-time robberies going on right there when you're just going about buying your thing at the shop. It's kind of the same because of the non-linear dynamics in which the cyberspace is actually characterized. Now, it's quite hard to fathom when you think about that, but then when you look at the concept of war in its own self, it's too non-linear in itself. And all the commanders of history, for example, I like Clausewitz and his definition of war, and and his book on war that actually gives us very massive insight into the theory of war. Clausewitz just placed this very squarely into the three parts that constitute a part of this trinity, which are passion, chance, and political purpose. And when we look at the fear of escalation and the realization of war's natural tendency to grow, there are two things at least. If you look at it from an abstract perspective, now first is the combination of two concepts, which is cyberspace and war. And cyberspace itself, like we rightly established, generally is very hard to define in its own self due to its non-linear nature. And the second itself, as a result, does not clarify understanding the state of war, because it models waters that are really not transparent to start with. So we've just got these two big terms, one linear and one that is not linear, and then we have to just bring them together to be able to define cyber warfare. Now, when we continue to observe, the use of kinetic forms of war, one key thing that comes up when you talk about cyber war in itself is how people have this imagination in their heads of, of this very big black screen and, people hidden in hoodies and typing things up and down. From the observations we have seen, and even, if you look into from the history, from history generally, the advancement of technology itself almost absolutely never replaces the position of kinetic war, and it's pretty much the same thing here. Generally, it's most likely not going to be taking the full place of kinetic forms of war, and we've learned again theoretically in history, and if we look at the days of the Cold War, for example, and if you look at the wonderful afterglows of the Gulf War, when a lot of people, it was widely thought generally that we were witnessing, a permanent triumph in, liberal democracy and market capitalism. And, we have the massive rise of military Western forces empowered by technology. Now, if you look at off the back of that, if you look at the war on terror, with America, and we could actually see just generally, that from their plain defeats in Afghanistan and, a very, very narrow victory in Iraq. But I think the point I'm trying to make is generally when these new technologies come and, with the massive hope it might bring, most of the time it really never takes up these positions of kinetic warfare. And also another part to also consider is, with the cyberspace, everything is almost on a playing ground because it just takes away the position of the David and Goliath kind of scenario where we've got the big and the small, and then the big most likely crashes the small. It's in itself is a very interesting place again that we'll be talking about. But in the truth, it's sometimes potentially very disruptive because when it comes to non-state actors, for example, which we have seen the rise of them, when we talk about APTs and advanced persistence groups. Cyberspace extends a lot of command control and communications and intelligence capabilities that just barely 10 years ago, or barely about 1 or 2 decades ago, we could see only the richest states being able to afford. And that's why I was talking about how it basically, brings a different tone and dimension to the observation, or to the whole story of example of a David and Goliath situation, because now we've got massive, huge nation states with a lot of budget and a lot of money going against on an almost playing field, with very small countries. And like I will give examples down the line, but one that easily comes to mind is North Korea, and they attack multiple times on American infrastructure. It basically just gives you some sort of somewhat equal playing space. The picture is rather different because when we look at the Iranian nuclear program, for example, that it has demonstrated very well, that capabilities like that don't come cheap, even regardless. Because I know that expert analysis, for example, from Stuxnet actually came around and said, look, this, although it was never publicized, or better still, it has never really been fully agreed, but it seems to be something targeted by the United States of America with a lot of collaboration or cooperation with Germany, with Israel, and also, some British and German forces actually being a part of that. Now, one thing that we would also see that can definitely be established from all this that I've been saying for the last couple of minutes, that is that going forward, when we look at contemporary warfare, what we do know for a fact is the future of war in itself will always be accompanied by cyber war in different kind of instances and of scenarios. Now, a lot of people would argue, and almost myself inclusive, that there would most likely never be a time, where all we just have is a full-blown cyber war, for very many reasons, most of which are academic and theoretical. But I clearly don't have time to actually start jumping that line now. But the cyberspace has actually changed a lot, and it has changed a lot less with the way states are being sponsored, and and what it has basically changed the relations between non-state entities and between states and non-state actors in very, very significant manners. And for one thing, it has been observed, the non-state use of of mass weapons of destructions, for enemies who possess no comparable infrastructure against them to retaliate. And it makes sense because if an ATP, for example, or an APT, for example, that is based in Russia decides to attack a known American or Irish critical infrastructure, how exactly is the government supposed to react? And which also comes again to why cyber warfare is a very tricky and very interesting space, because a lot of the time actors end up hiding behind anonymity, and you can't really attack an entity that you're not very sure of. If you look at it compared to kinetic forms of war, for example, there are usually a lot of beacons and pointers to know that some sort of warfare is coming. I mean, for example, you see forces by your border, you see all kinds of things. But with the space of cyber warfare, it's almost non-existent because you most times just don't know, you don't see it coming. And so when you can't really tie it down to a nation state, and sometimes even if you're able to do it, it takes so long, and the response time obviously ends up taking even much longer to be able to formulate a response. And by response, I'm not talking about recovery, I'm talking about an actual response to an act of war, if that's determined. So when we start to look at all these complexities, including how non-state actors actually come into place, the entire space of cyber war just continues to appear in its own complexities. Now, like physical violence, for example, cyber violence are conducted by states is always instrumental and it constitutes of both physical and non-physical acts. And these acts are a combination, in combination, they facilitate state goals specifically for potential wins, to win wars, obviously, and to relate policy objectives. The very critical thing, though, is the understanding that cyber war in its own self always has the first and second order effects, and and these effects have been achieved. They've been demonstrated multiple times in many instances. To conclude, I'll be talking about tactical, the known tactics that we've observed really in terms of cyberspace. In terms of cyber warfare over the past couple of years. And again, let's just keep in mind that, when we're talking about cyber war, in its approach to being key into a kinetic form of warfare, or in what you could see as a form or as a part of grand strategy in its own self, at the core of it all, there are three things you just want to disrupt: confidentiality, availability, and integrity. Really, at the end of it all, and you want to disrupt those three things. As it comes to your enemy, or in this case, whoever the target is, the target is. Now, our survival, in as much as of this industrial world in itself is predicted on systems that are established to manage everything. From critical infrastructure, such as electricity, gas lines, to very mundane and basic things, such as payments on the phones and, smart fridges and interconnected worlds and things like that. Now, we'll continue to see that our lives are being connected so much on a daily basis, and all these things are keyed into, the cyberspace and the fragility of its existence. I think the most interesting for me has to be the shift over the past couple of years from money actually being kept in vaults to just existing in its own self as a bunch of ones and zeros on a hard disk in the bank, and this just shows how much or how fragile it is, the position of things being kept together is when it comes to the cyberspace. Now, there are a couple of things that we've seen over the years that have been used very clearly when it comes to tactical use of cyber war. The first I would like to talk about is we've seen it in the digital interdiction of supply chains, where if you read one of Robert Pape's article, Bombing to Win, he identified, the different methods of leveraging air power to achieve strategic and tactical objectives. Now, what if the interdiction of supply lines did not actually require all that air power at all? And that's the kind of place that we're moving to. That's the generation that we are seeing at this moment, because states could definitely hack into supply chains and change orders and disrupt systems and components of it. And we've actually seen something similar in April 2013, when the States Armed Service Committee initiated in America initiated an inquiry to the extent and scope of APTs within the US Transcom, and that's the Transportation Command of the United States. And the US Transcom, they basically look after managing the people, trucks, trains, and all of that in terms of transportation when it comes to both peacetime and and war. And the APT had been there for so long, and they had identified about 20 advanced persistent threats that penetrated successfully and gotten access, to their systems. Of course, these are classified, like a lot of this classified. So the actual content of details of what they were able to access and whatnot are probably not public knowledge. But these penetrations in its own self for US Transcom were actually tied to Chinese actors in line with China's information operation strategies as identified by multiple sources. Another I would like to talk about would be the Aurora experiments and of course Stockness precision. When we talk about precision guided systems, they are basically they serve to hone the lethal focus of an offender onto a particular objective. And the isolation of targets has been very key, when it comes to precision systems. And the ability to locate and identify targets and strike it accurately, within time, and also determine, whether the desired effects have been achieved or not. Now, a particular experiment occurred in March of 2007, I think March 4 of 2007, at the Idaho National Laboratory in America. And what this experiment demonstrated was, was one of the most accurate descriptions of, the use of precision code, of cyber warfare, of potential, of what could potentially be done with warfare. And when we look at the classified documents from, the Department of Homeland Security, they indicate that, the demonstration was initiated after a vulnerability known as Aurora was found in their industrial control systems. And and the control systems that that was being referred to were basically spinning machines. And spinning machines generally consist of generators, compressors, and things within that regard. Now, to test it, they conducted a 27-ton diesel generator, and I basically targeted the code at the industrial machine. And then what happened basically was, what the code had, the code could not fully eliminate, the ability for something like the MI1 Abrams in its own self from firing, but then it basically stopped it from recovering or stopped the safety jack from actually coming on. And so when you apply that to actual military systems, for example, obviously, it's not going to totally decapitalize it. But when you talk about precision guided systems, you realize that it could actually alter the accuracy of location and and the rest of that. You can see it also with other examples constitute of Stuxnet and and how it was used to affect the enriched uranium of Iran. When you look at economic warfare, for example, we've seen cases on multiple times by Iran on the U.S. banking infrastructure that has led resulted in the Department of Justice charging even up to recently, I think in 2016, where where a couple of Iranian nationals were they were arrested and charged by the American government. And then we've also seen this play out in the North Korean attacks against South Korea and their financial infrastructure in Operation Troy, where multiple DDoS attacks were targeted at the banks to actually degrade them. Also, when we look at another tactic, which is hacking humans, now there have been there's really no evidence that this has been used as as a weapon in any cyber state attack. But then we actually saw this play out at one of the Blackout conferences a couple of years ago by Jerome Ratcliffe, at Jerome, where he basically just demonstrated how you could actually pretty much hack an IMD. And I remember, during an interview in 2013, where former Vice President Dick Cheney indicated that he had a pacemaker implanted in 2007. Basically, 30 minutes after, doctors definitely had to disable it because, they had to disable the wireless capabilities. They had to disable the wireless capabilities just to prevent the potential assassination. And finally, which again is the biggest of it all, we're talking about targeted critical infrastructure. When we look at Sandworm and the Sandworm APT attacks in Ukraine, and I like to talk about the Iranian-Israel crisis and then the Russia-Ukraine dilemma, when you talk about critical infrastructure, because that and cyber war, because they give you very perfect examples of what the future could look like. When we look at Sandworm and how it hit Ukraine, in 2015, three power utilities were hit, and basically took the entire grid of the entire Ukrainian grids offline and shut everywhere into darkness. Now, things like this, for example, and if you look at the current Israel-Iran crisis, you see different kinds of instances where attacks have been made against critical infrastructure. And at the end of the day, this basically will continue to pose a threat in terms of tactical decisions or in terms of how cyber warfare actually plays out across multiple nations. So the field is actually still very young in conclusion, and we will continue to observe. And unlike defined strategies and that currently exist when it comes to kinetic warfare, a cyber warfare in its own self is still very difficult to grasp and to put a very huge finger on and say these are the known strategies, these are the known tactics. But of course, as things continue to change and as we continue to depend even more on the internet, there will be seen more of all these things from different nation states and even not states non-state attackers. Well, thank you very much.
Oh, Joel, thank you. Let me just ask a follow-up question. Ireland is renowned for having slow broadband, for having an old infrastructure grid. Do you believe nations like Ireland are prepared to confront the kind of activity that we're seeing in cyber warfare that goes on a constant basis? What can Ireland and nations like Ireland do to get ready?
Well, I mean, I suppose there's always a chance to actually get better, to be honest, in general. And having a proper cybersecurity strategy and response plan as a country actually goes a very long way, and having a proper, critical devices recovery plan actually goes a long way in its own self and in its preparation. Now, when the HSC attacks came, happened a couple of months ago, it was identified that the security center actually had been going on for a while without the director. And I think just very key and very little things like that might go a long way. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to national policies really, and what the national plan is in terms of addressing cyber warfare or attempts at cyber warfare at the end of the day, and how basically they are being intentional about the protection of critical infrastructure. But then again, organizations also have a lot to do, because if you look at what is classified as critical infrastructure today, most of them won't even belong to the government. A lot of them in Ireland here, for example, a lot of the energy suppliers, which you would classify as critical infrastructure, actually are private organizations, are owned by the private sector. So I think some sort of enforcement also, of some sort of baseline kind of standard in terms of what is expected and what is acceptable, or an acceptable form of security within all those other spaces. But overall, I think it still goes back to having the right policies in place and the right preparation plans, because, like you rightly said, even in terms of weight, Ireland is actually quite small to a very large extent in these spaces. But yeah, it boils down to having a proper recovery plan, a proper response plan, and a proper national security strategy in place.
Thank you, Joel. Ireland is renowned for having notoriously slow and unreliable broadband. Our infrastructure tends towards the outdated. We recently had a severe attack on the HSE, our National Health Service, which reduced hospitals to working from paper for about 2 months. Keeping in mind the HSE attack, the constant testing of our banks, multinational tech companies, and constant breaches of devices in private homes, is Ireland prepared to confront cyber warfare? And what do you think we should be doing as a nation to prepare?
Well, I mean, I suppose there's always a chance to actually get better, to be honest, in general. And having a proper cybersecurity strategy and response plan as a country actually goes a very long way, and having a proper, critical devices recovery plan actually goes a long way in its own self and in its preparation. Now, when the HSC attacks came, happened a couple of months ago, it was identified that the security center actually had been going on for a while without the director. And I think just very key and very little things like that might go a long way. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to national policies really, and what the national plan is in terms of addressing cyber warfare or attempts at cyber warfare at the end of the day, and how basically they are being intentional about the protection of critical infrastructure. But then again, organizations also have a lot to do, because if you look at what is classified as critical infrastructure today, most of them won't even belong to the government. A lot of them in Ireland here, for example, a lot of the energy suppliers, which you would classify as critical infrastructure, actually are private organizations, are owned by the private sector. So I think some sort of enforcement also, of some sort of baseline kind of standard in terms of what is expected and what is acceptable, or an acceptable form of security within all those other spaces. But overall, I think it still goes back to having the right policies in place and the right preparation plans. Because, like you rightly said, even in terms of weight, Ireland is actually quite small to a very large extent in these spaces. But yeah, it boils down to having a proper recovery plan, a proper response plan, and a proper national security strategy in place.
Joel, given your expertise, I'm certain we will be talking to you much more in the future. Thank you very much. And now, with thanks to our sponsor, Palo Alto Networks, we have the Ireland Country Manager, Paul Donegan. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me today, and thank you to the other panelists. Some very insightful information there. So, as some people may or may not be aware of Palo Alto Networks, we're a global cybersecurity leader, and we see that what we're doing is we're shaping a cloud-centric future with technology that's transforming people and organizations, how people and organizations operate. And it's quite simple. Our mission is to be the cybersecurity partner of choice in protecting our digital way of life. But today, as we're talking about cyber warfare, or even around some of the learnings that we've seen around the key vulnerabilities or key threats across that landscape in the last 12 months, I want us to talk about some of the areas that our Unit 42, which is our threat research and security consulting group here at Palo Alto Networks, have looked at. So Unit 42 is our threat intelligence team, and what they do is they provide research that enables security teams to understand the adversary's intent and the enhance the protections that we offer around our products and services to try stop those advanced attacks. If anyone is not aware of them, it's unit42.paloaltonetworks.com. I think there's a lot of really good information for all organizations and people out there that they will get around the latest attacks, the latest trends that's out there, but also how they can protect themselves from that. So one of the areas we look at is if we look back on the last 12 months, we look at a lot of high profile attacks in terms of supply chain with SolarWinds. Chuck mentioned the Colonial Pipeline piece. I think that is that's something that's that was a key milestone when we look at how the political narrative changed, because we saw the White House again come out and talk about zero trust as a strategy, and the Pentagon produce papers again around how organizations can protect themselves from cybersecurity using zero trust as a strategy. And I think that's a key point in if we look at the history of how cybersecurity, or how organizations are going to protect themselves from cybersecurity is changing, because in Ireland specifically, we tend to in terms of technology adoption follow the US and follow trends in the UK, and although we're quite a bit behind, if we look at the profile of Ireland as a whole, we've quite a lot of quite a large footprint of foreign direct investment here as well. So a lot of US multinationals and global organizations who sit here. So we need to look at what those I suppose they're all out there looking at how the vulnerabilities that we've seen in the past 12 months have impacted those organizations, but also what's the reality of those threats, and the perception of how it's changed the impact to their businesses, and how catastrophic that could be for them moving forward. I think, like so many countries, Ireland, it's been targeted by ransomware gangs. I think the experience that we saw from the HSE really illustrates how disruptive an attack like that can be. It's also shows us the extent that these threat actors or gangs like the likes of Conti are going to, and the stakes that they're raising around their demands and the payouts is quite phenomenal, especially how it's evolved if we look at just even the last 2 years. If we even look at how they're looking to extort these organizations, so the tactics that they're using. Previously, you would have seen that they would have come in and maybe encrypted an environment and looked for a financial incentive to decrypt that environment. But now we're seeing multiple different extortion tactics, so they're coming back for more and more. And I think that's a key concern for Irish businesses and public institutions, and something that we need to look at. The other thing that's a bit of a concern, or an area to focus on, is the level of the attacks. So if we look at the potential costs of ransomware over the last 12 months, we look at the average ransomware demand has gone up by 518%, which is crazy. The average payment has gone up by 82% from 2020. I think the highest ransomware demand that we saw last year was between 15 to 30 million. And this year we've seen even as high as 50 million. So there's a pattern that's happening there. We're starting to see more and more of this. Is it nation states? That's I think that's yet to be determined. There's obviously a commercial or financial gain behind a lot of this, and I think that's a key concern for organizations. If we look at the pattern in which they're able to do this, and some of the things that we can do, okay, there's technologies that are out there that allow for that have features and they're around machine learning and AI that actually will allow organizations to add in preventative measures around that exploitation happening. But I think a lot of it really comes down to education, if I'm honest. I think if we look at one of the things that Nika was talking about, and we look at the adoption of trends, or we look at specific messaging, I think a lot of these threat actors or bad guys are using that and exploiting organizations with phishing campaigns. We see that the human being still is the kind of easiest point to go after, and they're one of the ones that from clicking on an email that's sent to them, like with the HSE, for example, it doesn't matter what technologies you've got deployed. If it's going to be someone who clicks on something to allow that vulnerability or that exploitation happen, that's something that we need to do. So I think education is going to be something that's key to organizations. And I think when we start to look at some of the things that we've learned over the last 12 months going into next year, and we look at some of the future trends, I think zero trust as a strategy, of course, is absolutely important. I think getting buy-in from boards will be something that is really important. I think that with, again, going back to Colonial Pipeline, if we look at the messaging that came out, I think that was a bit of a wake-up call for most boards within organizations. We see a lot of CISOs and IT network security managers, and I suppose C-suite personnel within organizations who are trying to protect their organizations struggle to get budgets, struggle with the way they communicate their cyber strategies back up to at board level. I think in the last 12 months, we've seen a lot of board level personnel come out and attend cyber related courses, which is great. But I think that they need to then echo that down throughout their employees. Larger organizations, of course, would have larger budgets and larger strategies in place to do it. But fundamentally, if we look at the profile of Ireland, 85% of our businesses are SMEs. So the impact of a cyber attack on an SME could end up with them going out of business. And if something as small as just some type of cyber education program could help them, I think it's definitely something that we need to look at and we need to address. I think when we go into next year, I think the ransomware and the type of attacks, I think, is going to continue. It's people are getting greedy now and they see opportunity to do that. I think that's something that's going to exponentially explode again. I think gone are the days where Ireland was seen as a smaller neutral country where no one was really attacking it. If we look at the profile of trends that we would have seen over the last 4 or 5 years, we would have seen mainland European organizations or the UK having a lot more activity to Ireland. But now we're seeing Ireland, the activity in Ireland increase quite a lot. I think it's important for any organization, if they're looking into the future, to look at kind of what does that look like, and some areas for them to focus on would be around that evolution of ransomware, looking at the technologies and the strategies that they've got deployed to have protections in place for that. I think they definitely need to be aware of if they are the victim of an attack, that the data and information that they have may not just be given back to them if they pay the ransom. So to have strategies in place around what that looks like as we move towards a more of a digital, as digitization and digital strategies become more and more important, data privacy and the kind of globalization versus localization of that data becomes more important, and organizations need to focus on investment in additional legal personnel to understand where that data resides and legislation around it. One of the other areas there is around passwords, and you know, our passwords going to be something of the past. Gartner was predicting that by next year, 60% of enterprises will look to no longer be using passwords. So I think the iPhone kind of allows for organizations to have kind of multi-factor authentication there. So whether that's going to evolve or not, I think the working from home, so the current environment that we're in with the pandemic and the working from home also presents itself as quite a difficult predicament for most organizations as to how do they secure that remote workforce. They're now at a stage where they have to protect their organization from a kind of like a data anywhere model, where data resides not only just in a data center, and they have that kind of that transient point to protect it, but it's anywhere, as well as people working from home across multiple devices. So it's having the personal devices and corporate devices and multiple IoT devices connected to the corporate network, and how do they do that? Again, as mentioned, cyber education is something that's really important, and the evolution of that education and how organizations look at having not only their staff but their internal teams protected is something that needs to be focused on. And then we kind of get down to, you know, as organizations deploy, or they work on their strategy and they start to deploy the different tactics, cyber hygiene is something that's going to be really important going into the future. So having a model that is not just a point in time model, but it's a model it's an evolution. They're always looking to consistently kind of turn that dial and add in additional improvements, I think is something that's really important as well. And that's just kind of, as I said, that's just an opinion as to where I see things at the moment within Ireland, within organizations that I'm talking to. But as we all know, it's an ever-changing landscape. It's something that the vulnerabilities and the processes in which these threat actors are exploiting those vulnerabilities today are going to be different tomorrow, and we're probably going to see more vulnerabilities and more exploitations of those vulnerabilities into the future. It just really depends on how organizations and people are prepared to educate themselves around how we can all be in this together, to all of us fight the criminals as one.
Paul, there are devices in every household, including many in the hands of our children. We teach them to hold hands and look before crossing a road. We teach them virus hygiene, especially during this pandemic. Given the Internet of Things is everywhere, is it time for us to get serious about teaching cybersecurity and awareness in our schools?
Absolutely. I think that if we look at schools in particular, and we look at kids, everyone at a certain point is wanting to have a device that's connected to the internet. And I think as society moves, we need to look at how do we leverage the protections that are in enterprises today at home. Most people think once they come home, they connect to the internet and they can click on anything they want. So because of, I think, the cyber criminals and how they leverage technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, what they're doing is they're indexing the internet. They're indexing to see what IPs they can get hold of. And a lot of it is opportunistic. But there are certain people who may have access to the internet at home, and those devices could be vulnerable. And all they're looking for is they're just looking to leverage some type of connection that will allow them to pivot, to be opportunistic, to make some type of money off it. So I think that from school age right up the way to university, even to your grandparents at home, I think we all need to realize that the world we live in today is different than the world of yesteryear, where cybersecurity and education around cybersecurity is key.
Paul, tell me about intellectual property. When Palo Alto Networks or other firms develop security programs and services, they package them for service and product sales. That is your business model. When you find vulnerabilities or a compromise, is there not a built-in disincentive to sharing threat information and helping create a safer environment for us to be connected and do business?
So we've actually set up a cyber threat alliance a number of years back, for that very reason, because as an organization, we don't believe that that information or threat intelligence should be kept; it should be shared. So the cyber threat alliance actually was set up for that very reason, and that's a collaboration of all cybersecurity, well, not all, but most cybersecurity organizations, where we share that threat intelligence so that everyone can benefit from a shared community of information. As I said, we're all in this together. So it's there's a saying, it takes a village to raise a child, and from a cybersecurity perspective, it takes all of us to fight the bad guys. So it's definitely something that I don't believe any organization should be doing. And the more information that we can get out there around those signatures or those indicators of compromise, from a threat actor perspective, I think it benefits every organization.
You mentioned that a cyber attack could put an SME out of business, especially given the hard hit that small businesses have taken during the pandemic. Owners are having to make tough financial decisions. Given the risk-benefit analysis, is it realistic that everyone from a household to SMEs can afford access to the kind of corporate security Palo Alto Networks provide industry leaders?
It's a very good question. Most organizations that are out there today, Palo Alto Networks in particular, we leverage, or an SME can actually purchase the same features, the same benefits, and the same technology that large global enterprises do, but specific for their size organization. And most other vendors in the market will also do the same. So I think that's really important to do. The kind of gone are the days where the technology was only for a large enterprise. It is the same feature sets that a large global 2000 organization has today and has deployed to prevent the bad guys from getting access to their environment, is available for the SME market today. And even actually more so with the announcement that we had around Occhio, around our home device, that we actually also have a device for personnel at home. And that's something with the same features that we would have from our enterprise class firewalls. So I think that's something that's really important, and it's just the way the market's going. So it's protections from from John or Bob, who's sitting at home looking to connect securely into their office, or looking to have protections for their children who are accessing the internet, right the way up to your large tech organizations who are spending hundreds of millions a year on security.
Chuck, I want to ask you, last year, there were reports of Russian intelligence assets conducting reconnaissance on the transatlantic cables that come aground in Ireland and connects North America to mainland Europe and the Baltics. Given Ireland being the European home to so many high-tech firms, from Microsoft to Google and Facebook to Dell, Ireland seems to have a soft underbelly that puts our economy and Europe itself at great risk. To your knowledge, is the US cooperating with Ireland on a 360-degree security from physical infrastructure to digital security?
The answer is yes. I don't know the extent of it. Probably some of that's classified. There's a lot of bilateral cooperation between the United States and Ireland and the United States and UK. But it is also a strategic issue. As you mentioned, a lot of multinationals are located for tax purposes, mostly in Ireland. And so it's been there for many, many years. And that's vital to the commerce of our country in the United States and vital to the commerce of the world. So absolutely, that's considered quite a vulnerability. It's not the only place that we've seen some perimeter activities on these cables. So I think part of the other aspect of this is to back up other means of communication, and I think we're seeing a lot of that transition to satellites now, which have other vulnerabilities. But I think redundancy in communications is going to be really important, and I think security, particularly among those areas that you mentioned, are high priority and considered a strategic priority by both countries and by EU and also, a lot of parts of the other globe. So to make a long story shorter, yes.
Joel, I'd like to hear from you. Given Ireland's status as part of Europe and yet not part of NATO, with the UK's withdrawal from the EU and Ireland's security reliance on them dwindling, given our small military and policing forces, huge international tech footprint and deep connections to Europe, is Ireland not likely to be a major focus for cyber warfare to harm Europe? And are we prepared?
That's a very good question. Well, yeah, I mean, just like it's in the scope of the EU, for example, and like you have rightly mentioned at some points during this conversation, Ireland is a very strategic country, basically. And in fact, if I think at the end of it all, what's one of the key things that the warfare tends to do, or one of the key achievements of war, or one of the key approaches to war, is to cut off communication lines and also resource lines, basically. And so, which even if you look at World War I and World War II, for example, a lot of these things escalated, especially in the First World War. A lot of this actually escalated because people were going after allies, and then it just never stopped. So it could be the same, not just Ireland, but generally. If I was going to attack, a place, well, not me, but like, if a nation was going to attack, another nation, let us say in Africa, for example, one of the key strategic countries you'll be looking to bring down would be Nigeria. It's just a state of fact, and I think it's pretty much similar here. If we had something very similar, the massive scale, definitely Ireland could be a very major target because of how it interconnects with a lot of other countries, and because of the relations that they have with a lot of other countries. And again, like you said, because of all these very key strategic parts of very key strategic communication parts and lines that are actually laid here within Ireland. And let us also not forget that for a very long time, Ireland has been, has had a neutral status, and therefore a lot of trust has been established in terms of diplomatic trust here within Ireland and multiple other nations in its own self. So yeah, definitely, one could actually imagine a scenario whereby Ireland could be a critical target, depending on which other country is being targeted in that space.
Nika, with so many making themselves more vulnerable to hybrid warfare manipulation by self-selecting their news sources and entering a self-imposed echo chamber, and given our separation from the continent, which deprives us of daily close contact with Eastern Europeans, does our alienation from the continent, does that create a special challenge for Ireland, given historic westward orientation? What might we learn from what similar small states in the Baltics have experienced?
Well, in general terms, I think first, as maybe there is not that much physical contact or travel destinations towards Eastern Europe, it's not a big obstacle because, as you set the ground yourself, people now sneak peek into the world through their smartphones, through internet. So there are means how to basically reach out and connect bilateral relationships or projects or things. Of course, there need to be some, I mean, just because there is no current interest, it doesn't mean that such bonds can't be created in the future. And easiest would be through, internet, social media, and other projects like that. What Ireland could learn from the Baltic states, I guess, partially, Baltic states are part of bigger communities. They are part of basically kind of regional gameplay and things like that. And Ireland is also like very interconnected with its neighbors, with its close allies, and also a very influential hub. Baltic states also for a long time was Russia's way into the Europe through the Baltic Sea. Transit was there, so it was also very kind of influential kind of place to be from the Baltic states perspective. The old energy grid, including electricity, gas pipelines, it goes and to some extent went through the Baltic states and Eastern Europe from Russia towards the West. So being in that position means that you are basically in the middle of some larger dynamics, and it's very crucial to find your own place and to understand where winds are blowing and how to make sure that you are blown into the right direction, or you are steering your kite yourself. So I guess, of course, we can't just literally transmit experience from the Baltic states that has big hegemonic neighbor just on the other side of the border with Ireland directly, because you are situated in also like you are an island essentially, and yeah, you have a different geographical disposition as well, but nevertheless, yeah, if we look from kind of political perspective, there are similarities, and hopefully you will not experience some of the dynamics that we had experienced being a hub in a sense.
And last but not least, Paul. Paul, you've heard from the others. Palo Alto networks can build walls, plug holes, and repair damage. But if you had a magic wand, what would you like to see Ireland do better to address cyber warfare and emerging threats?
Yes, it's a good question. I suppose there's no real, single wave your wand and that's there. I think it's a multifaceted approach. So, looking at your environments today, looking at your go-to-market as an organization, and strategically thinking about where are the keys to the kingdom, and how can you protect them. I think that's really important. So, Chuck mentioned the zero trust model. I think that's something that's very important as a strategy for organizations to look at what are the tactics that they need to deploy in order to have that model for them to protect the data. I think that's really important. But looking at Ireland as a whole, we've got a gap at the moment in kind of two ways. We've got a gap in education. I think that's really important from a wider perspective. But we've also got a gap in personnel. So at the moment, there's more roles open in Ireland from a cybersecurity perspective than there has ever been. So I think the position that we're in from an EU perspective actually puts us in a really strong, positive place, because we're able to have other members or people from different states come to Ireland and work here. If we look at the demographic of Ireland as a whole, we've an awful lot of foreign employees who are here, which is great. It's great from a cultural perspective, and it's great from a skills perspective. And I think we need a lot more of that. So continue to open our borders to kind of get those highly skilled people in. I think that's definitely something that we need to do, and that will go a long way to helping us be more open in terms of how we do business with the rest of the world.
Declan, first of all, let me thank you for agreeing to be our moderator today. It's not often we get a best-selling author whose book has been made into a movie to be our moderator. So I want to thank you. Tell me a little bit about your background, if you would.
Sure. Well, my background, like many, I suppose, within your audience, started within the military. I served in the Irish Defence Forces for over 12 years, starting off as an infantryman and moving into heavy weapons in our small but potent artillery corps, going to our military college, moving into areas that involved armoured reconnaissance, doing a lot of internal security work, serving in overseas peacekeeping missions, and then moving into our defence headquarters. And I also got the opportunity to attend university through my time in the Defence Forces. That set me with a platform across a range of security and defence modalities and issues. And on leaving the regular Defence Forces, I moved into work in media in the area of security and defence analysis, some teaching and training work, and I still keep my boots dirty. I'm on a panel of civil military coordination experts that the state supplies for UN, EU and NATO related missions, and I still do a bit of teaching and lecturing in that area.
When you teach and when you lecture, what are the topics you address most?
A lot of times when I'm dealing with a domestic Irish audience, oftentimes we're talking about matters on a general basis that are very related to the topics being discussed today. And that is the Irish state, Irish society's perhaps lack of awareness, lack of situational awareness, and our lack of self-awareness when it comes to security and defence issues. There is a well-documented historic squeamishness within the Irish body politic about dealing with these matters. Yet, for people who have an interest in these things from a historic point of view, you will see since and during the Second World War, Ireland has again a well-documented history of saying and taking positions in public and then doing things under the table with natural partners and allies. I personally would love to see these things get properly conjoined. I think it's high time that as a society, we acknowledge these things in public, acknowledge the fact that a small, versatile state like Ireland cannot entirely secure itself. No more than we could build our corporate reputation by ourselves. We required partners in Europe and in the US. We require that with regards to a defence and security posture, particularly when it comes to things like cybersecurity, but across a raft of security issues, be it the harder edged of kinetic related security to what I have taken to calling in a recent paper I gave to our International and European Affairs think tank here in Dublin, moral security, which is something I think that is being eroded or attacked across Western Europe in the various online platforms that exist and that have been infiltrated by extremist groupings and nation state actors. And indeed, we know the Russians are very capable of exploiting weaknesses within discussion groups and sowing seeds of dissent. And I think it's something that as a state and a society within Ireland and within a European Union context, we really have to formulate a cogent policy and operational response.
I'm always surprised when I see comments that directly undermine our confidence in our democracy, our institutions, our values. I click on the posters and find they have no history. There's no evidence that they really exist. They have no families, they have no jobs. And yet those get echoed by people here in Ireland who do have a physical presence, who live down the street, who eat at the same restaurants we do, who work with us. How concerned are you that this hybrid warfare is growing, even if unintentionally, it's growing here as part of our body politic?
I'm particularly concerned about the degree of innocence that gets exhibited within our body politic and within our media classes through no necessarily fault of their own. And it's down to what I would put, to use a well-worn military term, as a lack of situational awareness, education and training, and perhaps a lack of self-awareness. And I think that, you know, I used to have a commanding officer in defence headquarters who talked about the importance of addressing what he called low-hanging fruit issues. And I think that that's where we need to start in Ireland, at the low-hanging fruit. What are the things that we can start to address? Within media and body politic circles, I think having a little bit of an education program about where people start to take note of the very things you mentioned there in your question, which is track record of an individual commenting, sparking your early warning antenna, sparking your natural tendency to be somewhat skeptical or suspicious of people commenting online that don't have a track record of congruity, which ultimately I would sum up as this. In Ireland, we need to start to become more aware of incongruous behaviour and spotting interruptions in patterns, and therefore preventing ourselves from becoming unwitting cat's paws for other people's agendas. And that would be a big step in the right direction. It would also perhaps spark a bigger discussion that we're starting to have to some extent since the cyber attack on the HSE, but I think it needs to be augmented and made a more of a whole of government approach. Because again, one of the things that is obvious from the discussions today is that there needs to be a whole of government approach, not just in Ireland, but across Europe, in how we respond to the emerging hybrid threats, be they cyber or of other natures. A siloed approach within government departments or within security institutions is not the way to go. I mean, across the Atlantic, our cousins, shall we say, in the United States learned to their cost how that siloed approach can work at its most negative when 9/11 happened, because of, well, for one reason, lack of the necessary communication between two of the key agencies, the FBI and the CIA. So we need to learn these lessons and not repeat them.
Do you think that we have the appetite for it? Ireland's small. We've been a neutral nation for so long. Even entertaining those questions for many people takes us a bit too close to becoming part of the military apparatus that the country has traditionally forsaken. Do you think we can have that dialogue in Ireland as adults? Because with the Internet of Everything, from our children's devices hooked up to watch YouTube for kids, to our smartphones, to our computers, which we're working at from home as remote workers during the pandemic, isn't it time we have it? And do you think there's the appetite for it?
To answer the latter part of your question, it is time that we've had a change in approach and recognition of the nature of threat facing Ireland. Ireland as a state, as a corporate citizen, as a trading nation, and as a society in general. There are a raft of threats that are facing us, and the ones that are the worst are the ones that are the most insidious, that can affect our children and those in vulnerable stages of their development because of the access nefarious agents have in getting into our mindsets. It's not like they have some major barriers to cross because of the nature of how online communication has evolved. However, I'm an optimist at heart, and I'm also an historian in terms of how I take things on board. And if you look at Irish history, we have made massive sea changes and jumps in our consciousness and our positions about things that at the time when they were hard held, people would have thought this will never change. What I'm talking about, just to give a couple of examples to give context, include the sea change in our approach to national identity and concepts about dual state relationships on the island of Ireland, the acceptance by the vast majority of Irish people of the legitimacy of a group of people in the 6 counties of this island, known as the Unionist community, to be Irish and to have an identity that is linked to Britain. That is an accepted thing, not just socially, but legally and constitutionally. Nobody would have perceived that happening 20 years before that. Again, nobody would have perceived Ireland becoming the type of trading nation that it is, or tech savvy and tech supportive nation that it became. Certainly when we were back in the 1950s and emerging, blinking into the international community, when our then Taoiseach Sean Lemass and one of the senior civil servants on his watch, Ken Whitaker, set about creating the architecture for Ireland to become an engaged, plugged-in member of international commerce. Now, why did we do those things? Need drove those things, and senior policymakers recognized the need to take Irish society by the hand and lead them towards the light. The same thing has to be done with regards to security and defense. We have labored for a long time, or rather we have benefited from the labors of others because of our geographical and social location. We've been sandwiched between two of our major partners, the UK, the US, and then mainland Europe to our south. Times are changing. The nature of threat is changing. It's not purely kinetic, as we have seen. And the hybrid nature of warfare, such as what happened to the Estonians, in particular in Tallinn in 2007, when their country was brought to a standstill through a cyber attack, that is widely accepted by people in the security and defense analysis space as having emanated from Russia. And that was done to prove a point. It was an exercise of an imperial bullying power, for want of a better way of putting it. But it shows you how vulnerable small states are to that, and how vulnerable they are in that they can't call on their neighbors and allies because there's no direct smoking gun in the way there would be if Russian tanks had surged across the border, or if there had been a Russian-inspired air attack. We now live in an era where if we're not under threat from non-state actors who may be difficult to detect, we are under threat from totalitarian state actors who are well versed in being able to, shall we say, move as wolves in sheep's clothing through the concept of hybrid warfare. So this is something that we have to think about, develop policy about, and start educating from the ground up.
I spoke to a municipal water manager in Nebraska last week, and they were suffering persistent cyber attacks, which kept them from purifying the water. And basically, they had to put out a boil water notice for the entire county for 3 weeks. Can you imagine, given our infrastructure, are we terrifically exposed to that kind of cyber attack? And would it have collateral effect in destabilizing our trust and confidence in our institutions, our government, and the private industries that keep it all together?
On a negative note, I think Ireland is very exposed to an attack of that nature on our water infrastructure, or our electric infrastructure, or, as we have seen, our health infrastructure, because our cyber defenses are so poor and lack conjoined approach. But that's only one part of the nature of such a threat, because if that was sustained, as you outlined in your example about Nebraska, I think you stated, it would have a very harmful effect on public morale and in public support of the establishment and the authorities. It can, something like that, it would be quite easy through an appropriate social media campaign to sow seeds of distrust, dissent, and confusion. We've seen that happen to an extent in the pandemic. On a positive note, a small cohesive society like Ireland has the advantage, though, of being able to, if it approaches and prepares properly, being able to surmount those kinds of difficulties, because we do have strong social networks. We do have strong sense of community, as has been proven during this pandemic. But we can't keep taking it for granted. And we have to realize where our vulnerabilities lie. And that starts with recognizing that we are not just a target. That a lot of people can't accept that concept because they live in a different era in their mindset. History has been superseded. The facts of the rules have changed. Not alone are we a target, we're a legitimate target in many people's eyes for a whole variety of reasons. Whether one agrees with those reasons or not is irrelevant. The fact is that we are a target, and a target that isn't necessarily going to be approached or attacked via conventional military means. But the defense approach to this has to be one that has a variety of defense mechanisms brought into play. Some conventional military, some policing, some political, and some from a moral point of view. And what I mean by that is, one of the key things, to come back to your point about water utilities being sabotaged or damaged or degraded in some way, is how that can affect our sense of resilience. And I think, again, we're back to the concepts. Everything in this form of defense starts from enhanced situational awareness, enhanced self-awareness, to be able to understand what's happening and then respond appropriately, and not to sit down underneath it. And I think there's a lot of lessons available to us from the pandemic. The majority, thankfully, in Ireland have responded to what needed to be done. They've stepped up. They've shown support for their communities and each other. But there has been a small but vocal minority who have been disruptive. And I would argue, and I don't think this is peculiar to Ireland, I think within the Western world, the disruptive element, let's call them the disruptive minority, have shown that when some people are faced with something that's too difficult to process, to cognitively digest, that they create an alternative reality. And they want to live in that reality because that suits them better, even if it's totally unrealistic or even dangerous to them. Now, what we have to realize is that there are nefarious elements out there who have also come to that conclusion. And what they're doing is they're looking for those weak elements, those people who can't look reality in the eye and respond, who don't have the resilience or the situational awareness tools. And they're using them as unwitting cat's paws. And that's a danger within Western society, because we're free and open societies, and the online world is free and open. And those people are assets to be exploited by those who have a philosophy and a policy and who know how to operationalize that kind of weakness.
And certainly fatigue. The longer it goes on, the more fatigued people become, and the more they might listen to that kind of, if you will, nonsense. There's a fatigue point at which people start to break, and that's only natural. I want to go back to the last point, and then we've got to go. I appreciate your time. And that's a policy issue. You talked about after 9/11 how different agencies within the United States had the strands of information that might have prevented the attacks, but they didn't share them for structural reasons, for competition between agencies, for budgetary reasons. They're numerous. In Ireland, do you think it's possible for us to create a cybersecurity system, a platform, which takes into account the Garda, the naval resources, whether they're the Coast Guard or the Navy, the military, the civilians? Part of our infrastructure is owned privately. Our banks, our tech sector. Can we come up with that all Ireland, that global or universal platform in which people are willing to cede power, stop being protectionist, and come together to give us that kind of network without weak links?
Yeah, I think we can, but I'm under no illusions about the steepness of the hill that would have to be climbed. But I think it's a hill that has to be climbed, and I think it starts with a sensitizing of our policymakers. They have to become more aware of how important this is, that this is just as important as anything of a medical nature, re the pandemic, or in over the decades of the necessary business, commercial and financial adjustments that were made in this country, and the institutions and organizations such as, for example, the Industrial Development Authority, that were created to harness the assets that were available to us when we joined the European Union. So I think if we sensitize policymakers and elements within our civil service to have a greater awareness, what we need to be moving towards, to, I suppose, say in shorthand, is a national security agency or authority that can shepherd the very things that you've mentioned. Because the problem, and I say this from my own experience in the Defence Forces and then later with the organizations like the United Nations, is the biggest enemy to open society is siloed approaches. We need to have things conjoined. Now, there is an entity that was put in place, was created only just over 2 years ago, the National Security Analysis Centre, which is supposed to be part of the Department of An Taoiseach, our Prime Minister. And it's a copy, it's something I had been writing about on and off in mainstream media for a few years. The New Zealanders and the Australians have alternately what they call the Bureau of National Assessments, or the National Assessments Bureau. It's a very innocuous term for what is a national level security analytical advisory function with a direct line to the Prime Minister and other senior policymakers. If we had something of that nature that had the necessary clout and connectivity, and they could act as a coordinating function, because this is where we are falling down. As you said quite correctly, Garda Síochána approach cyber from a point of view of a crime. Has a crime been committed? The same way they approach intelligence activities. The Defence Forces obviously will look at it from a threat point of view and from a very military perspective in terms of defence against cyber warfare. But we need a more conjoined and a more agile approach to this, and a more mobile approach to this. Some of your viewers to this whole excerpt will probably be aware when the cyber attack on the HSE took place in Ireland. There was this discussion about the Garda cybersecurity entity taking on board an approach to charge people or to maybe cooperate with the Russian authorities. That kind of conversation is totally unhelpful because it shows a lack of understanding about the landscape out there. What we need to be ensuring is that we can't be taken advantage of again. We're not going to be able to bring these people before a court of law and charge them. And even if we could, it'd be a waste of our resources and time. So we need to better harness our resources. And that comes back to us having a national security agency. There is a national cybersecurity centre, which is still awaiting its appointment of a new director. It used to be the case that you had a number of Garda Síochána and Defence Force officers with the appropriate tech background sitting on that. But one of the points I would make is that if we take purely a tech approach to protecting ourselves from cyber security threats, we're missing the point. That's only one of the levels of threat. It's not purely a tech threat, and it won't be purely solved by tech responses. We need a better defence in depth. And that includes better situational awareness, better conjoined intelligence gathering of threat intelligence. And that requires all of our agencies, not just, and I'm not just talking about the primary security agencies like Garda Síochána and the Defence Forces and their relevant departments, but all government departments having a better awareness, being sensitized in the concept of threat intelligence, in the concept of what the threat is for a society and state like ours. A lot of the work I've done in the last number of years, between either work I've done on secondment to the UN or in some consultancy work I've done at a very small level with government departments or the likes of Department of Foreign Affairs, that there is very much a lack of awareness in this area. It's an infantilized level of awareness compared to the sophisticated levels of awareness about so many other things. So what we need, Ireland has an imbalance. On so many levels, our society has, and our body politic, our civil service have very sophisticated high levels of comprehension and ability to create solutions and address situations, be they cultural, political, economic, and a whole variation thereafter. But when it comes to the security and defence arena, because of our history, because of our squeamishness, because our response to our concept of neutrality has been to walk around things and not address things and put our heads in the sand, we have prevented our development in this area, our cognitive development. And so I find myself oftentimes in very frustrating situations, be it in media circumstances or sometimes with political figures, having conversations where things don't add up. And the best way I would describe it is where somebody who's a university math student is trying to have a serious conversation about mathematical theory and development with somebody who is only a grade school education. That has to be changed. We have to change the parameters so that we're all able to, at the very least, have the same conversation, even if we disagree about fundamental points. At the moment, that's not happening to the extent that it needs to for proper policy to come out of the discussions.
I'm worried about transactionalism. An Irish fisherman recently pulled up a Russian sonar buoy and brought it ashore. We have an increase in Russian flights to Tupolev's off of the west and south coast. We have reports of submarines operating without their GPS, their pinging going on, operating in a stealth mode. We have the reports last summer of the Russian FSB supposedly diving and looking at our transatlantic cables with North America that connect the continent and the Baltics to Ireland. With a lack of joined up thinking, everybody would say, well, that's a security issue at the transatlantic cable. That's a maritime issue. But then when you take a look at what's going on with hybrid warfare, weaponizing information, destabilizing government, undermining our confidence in our institutions, is it time for us now to have a minister of cyber security and information to pull all of these threads together so that we have a comprehensive look?
I think having a minister for, shall we say, cybersecurity would not be a bad thing. I certainly think I could see all the benefits of it. However, speaking as an Irishman with a fair degree of knowledge about the corridors of power when it comes to security and defence, I can't see that happening anytime soon. And it comes back to what I would term as the squeamishness. However, that's not a reason to kick the idea to touch. I think what we have to do is, when I was in the military with new developments and new equipment, we used to use the term about, is it soldier proof? You know, would a thing last, you know, in a typical busy infantry unit, a new weapon system being kicked about the place and whatever. I would say, is it hiberno proof, such a concept of creating a minister for cybersecurity? I don't think that's a runner. But I do think what can be done is you hiberno proof it. So what does that mean? That you say, maybe we look at existing departments and we see, is there a particular department that could take proper ownership? Technically speaking, it's the Department of Communications that is in charge of cybersecurity matters. Now, I don't think that's an ideal fit. It could be made to work better by having the appropriate staff and specialists, or you could take it and put it into either justice or defence. Now, you made a very valid point about the Garda Síochána's approach to cybersecurity. It's from the point of view of crime. It's like it's at a level that it's like that they don't want to acknowledge that there's a level beyond that, which is more complex. And I think there was a lesson learned by the Canadians many years ago, where they used to house all of their domestic security requirements within the RCMP, the Mounties, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they're federal police. And then as a result of realizing that if you require policemen to deal with national security issues all of the time, they will be policemen. They will look at it from a police point of view. So we either address, if we're going to have it within justice, that we address that and we start to develop a cadre of people that are national security specialists, or we decide to use defence to hold on to that area, to be the lead agency in that area. The bigger problem I would see with regards to that, without going down the rabbit hole and into the minutiae of Irish public affairs issues, is that it would be a departmental one. The Defence Force personnel have some very highly skilled cyber security specialists. I would say more so than in Garda Síochána. They've been recruiting and developing in that area. However, I would, I don't say it with any ill will, but I don't think our department, our defence department, would be fully up to speed on these matters and issues. And there would be some time needed to, again, a sensitization program. However, I think our Justice Department officials might be in a better position to think about that. And that, but it's on Garda Síochána, the operational side of law enforcement, our national police, would not be in the ideal position to provide the on-the-ground operators. So the best way, I think, to deal with that is to augment and speed up the National Security Analysis Centre and to have them take more of a leadership role in all matters to do with national security, and to be able to point to the finger at areas that need resourcing and areas that need development, and that they act as a channel of information between the coalface and the policymakers, a trusted channel of information. And I think at the moment, I think it was a great idea when it was started. I've heard very little about it since the pandemic kicked off. They were supposed to be working on a white paper about what exactly their role was going to be. Nothing has come of that yet. I think we really need to be thinking more about that. I also think this discussion is happening at an interesting time where our defense forces there is a review taking place. There's a commission on the future of the defense forces. And everything I hear about it does not fill me with optimism. And I think that we could be missing a very good opportunity where both the defense forces being revamped and the National Security Analysis Centre being stood up, that these are opportunities to address the very points you made that you were suggesting could come under a Minister for Cyber Security Warfare. Personally, if I was going to create a new ministerial post, I'd call it a Minister for National Security, because there is a number of strands that would come in under that. And I think cyber warfare, we're trying to get away from a siloed approach. I think there should be a multi-approach. Now, I just took one term there in terms of national security. There might be other terms that could be used. Some people might argue it might sound a little bit Orwellian. And that, again, is a problem with policymakers in this country, is that they will worry incessantly about how this can be presented to the public in general and the media in particular, and them taking it up in a very negative process and making some of those links that I've just mentioned. So can we do this? Yes, we can, but we have to think about the optics of it, and then we have to think about the operational realities of what it should be doing and how it can be best linked into policy making. I think if we do that and pull a template together, that something can be achieved.
Well, like you, I share your concerns about the recent military review. I come from a legislative background in the House and the Senate. I'm surprised that Donegan hasn't had a role in this. The defense forces have a limited role in their own future. And my concern is that if we start implementing this, good, bad, or indifferent, it'll be an excuse that we don't need to address this again for another 10 years. And the issue for me isn't really, should we be doing these things, is why aren't we doing them today? Every child has access to the internet. And if we're working from home, a child's device gets infected, it infects our network, infects our business. We have electronic milking going on. We have farmers farming by GPS positioning with high precision, and we rely on those yields for profitability and for food security. Every aspect of Irish life relies on digital security. And I, like you, think it's time that we start to address it. I'm Miceal O'Hurley, and you've been watching In Conversation this week. I want to thank our moderator, Declan Power, for some great insights, for moderating an exciting panel, and to all the panelists who gave their time to give us their insights. And I think we're going to probably be visiting this issue again. Declan, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you all soon. Stay safe.
So I'm Declan Power, security and defense analyst. It's been my privilege to engage with these highly versed and skilled individuals. I hope you found our discussion and interactions useful and engaging as I have, and I look forward to engaging with many of you in the future.